Thank you for choosing to watch our video. Please like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. Leave us a comment and watch the other videos that we're happy to provide for you. And now, on to the sermon.
Benjamin Franklin said that anger is never without a reason, but seldom with a good one. Never without a reason and seldom with a good one. I think over the last, maybe it doesn't extend it too far, but about the last 20 years, I think American society has gotten more polarized. And because it's gotten more polarized, we've seen a lot more instances of outbursts of anger, of people really being angry, of yelling and screaming. And I think that's a pretty fair assumption to make. And when you think about yelling and screaming, it produces something. It produces disorder. It produces anger. It produces confusion. It is, as we're going to look at tonight, a tool of the devil. And I'll tell you, it is an incredibly effective one. When you take what all it can contribute, as far as congregations are concerned, as far as families are concerned, as far as people are concerned, just thinking about for a moment some of the more deleterious effects of what happens with anger. Notice this. People who are yelled at in childhood, it can cause anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, behavioral problems, and sleep problems. It causes us to interpret ourselves and the world much more negatively. That's a lot of effects that come from just yelling and screaming. And one of the reasons that I bring this up is not because I've got some secret knowledge that I'm trying to hit at with someone here, but I just want to show and I just want us to understand that even with us, hopefully, in doing everything that we possibly can to be righteous, holy people, we can still fall into the temptation of doing this. Let me show you. Let's turn to Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. We're going to talk about religious people who should know better. Luke chapter 23. I just want you to notice in verse 23, but they were insistent. The Jews had whipped up the crowd. They were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. And that's even when you think about Pilate, because if you back up into verse 22, here's Pilate. Then he said to them the third time, "Why, what evil has he done?" They've stirred these people up, caused them again to be yelling and screaming, clamoring for Jesus to be put to death. And Pilate is asking why. He hasn't done anything. Some of these effects are just truly, truly terrible. And so just in thinking about this, we're going to look at religiously what has yelling and screaming accomplished. And we can see this actually a lot in the book of Acts. And then as we move away from the book of Acts, we're going to just note in some other places in Scriptures what this can do and why it is something that we need to, as best as absolutely possible within us, have control over. Let's go to Acts chapter 16. In Acts chapter 16, we're going to begin by just looking at the idea of used by religious and those who are irreligious in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16 is well known to us because it has the incident of Paul in Philippi. There he is able to convert Lydia and other women by the side of the river. He's able to convert the Philippian jailer. But just notice in Acts chapter 16, and let's start looking in verse 16. This kind of gives a good context for us. Now as it happened as we went to prayer, a certain slave girl possessed with the spirit of divination met us, who brought her masters much profit by fortune telling. This girl then followed Paul and us, cried out, saying, "These men who are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." And this she did for many days. But Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to her in the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ, come out of her." And he came out of her that very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And that kind of begins this account. If you're glancing on down through verse 22, it is in essence a mob action. And mob action is always going to produce rash results, because you kind of take a break from that account to kind of move to Paul and Silas being put in prison and then the Philippian jailer being converted. We come back now down, if you would, in verse 35. We come back now to the main narrative. In verse 35, the main narrative kind of picks back up, and there it says, "And when it was day, the magistrates sent the officers, saying, 'Let those men go.' So the keeper of the prison reported these words to Paul, saying, 'The magistrates have sent to you to let you go. Now therefore depart and go to peace.' But Paul said to them, 'They have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans.'" Paul had made that point in just a few verses prior. "We are Roman citizens, and they have thrown us in prison. Now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come themselves and get us out." So the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they had heard that they were Romans. But they came and pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to depart from the city. But these people, whipped into a frenzy, were ready to throw these people who unlawfully they had no right to in prison. Now obviously good came from it, but you can see what is taking place. When we go into the next chapter, let's go into Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, look starting in verse 5. This is Paul in Thessalonica. So Acts chapter 17, looking starting in verse 5. And there the account is telling us, it says there, Acts chapter 17 and verse 5, just a moment. There it reads for us that the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, then took up some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all of the city in an uproar, attacked the house of Jason, sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have now come here," again whipping them into a frenzy. "Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus." They troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city, and when they had heard these things, so when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Again, the multitude stirred up. Maybe one of the best known places before we get to Acts chapter 19 is actually in Acts chapter 21. So if you go to Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21 is the narrative. We'll begin in verse 27. Acts chapter 21 is the narrative now. Paul has been traveling on his third journey. He's been raising funds for the Jerusalem church. And now as we reach Acts chapter 20 or so, he's finally able to make it to Jerusalem to give that contribution of which he's written so much to. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the book of Romans. He's now ready to deliver it. But the Jews brought up charges against him. One of those charges being that he had brought Gentiles into the temple, which was unlawful. Trophimus. So when we get to Acts chapter 21 and we look in verse 27, notice again what is taking place. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, Paul had entered into a vow with 4 other men. He had agreed to pay for their vow, the expenses of them taking a vow. This would curry favor with the Jews, let them see that he was trying to uphold the traditions just like every other good Jew would do, but yet still understanding his responsibility in Jesus Christ. So here these 7 days are ended. The Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd, laying hands on him. And then look at this in verse 28, crying out, "Men of Israel, this is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, the place. Furthermore, he's also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought them into the temple. Notice they didn't have any evidence. They just supposed it. And verse 30, all of the city was what? Disturbed. The people ran together, they seized Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison at all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He took the soldiers, the centurions, he ran down to them, and when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Look in verse 34. And some among the multitude cried one thing, and some another. And when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded them to be taken into the barracks. 35, he reached the stairs, and he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. That's just incredible. Just incredible. What Paul went through in doing what was right, in trying to stand for truth, it's just amazing. And I'll tell you what's even more amazing. When you look in Acts chapter 24, turn down to Acts chapter 24, because in Acts chapter 24, this is Paul's account of what he was doing. So this is Luke's account, the historical narrative. But notice what Paul says about it. Luke chapter 24, or Acts chapter 24, verse 18. In the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. So yes, while they stirred up, while they had all of this to be done, so mob violence. With me, nothing. It's just amazing what the Apostle Paul, as he went from place to place, was willing to put up with. But I think I say the best, but when I say the best, I really mean the worst. Probably the worst display is the very detailed account that Luke gives us of Paul in the city of Ephesus. So let's look in Acts chapter 19, because I just want you to note the case study here. Yelling and screaming, whipping people up into this frenzy in Acts chapter 19. And we'll just go through these quickly. Demetrius stirs up the people. Acts chapter 19, and let's begin in verse 23, and we'll actually see what the whole nature of the problem was, and then we'll just kind of go from there. So Acts 19, starting in 23. And about that time there arose a great commotion about the way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who had made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. He called them together with workers of similar occupation. He said, men, you know that we have prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and you hear that not only at Ephesus, throughout almost all of Asia, that Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that there are not gods which are made with hands. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised, and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. So, of course, that sets the stage. And you can already see in that 23rd verse, things were beginning to happen. So when you look down in verses 28 and 29, the crowd cried out. They were filled with confusion. You move on down into the 32nd verse. In the theater, some cried one thing, some cried another. In verse 32, you also notice just simply the idea that in the assembly some were confused. Why are we here? Alexander in verse 33 wants to make a defense to the people. Look down in verse 34. For 2 hours, they are yelling and screaming, great is Diana of the Ephesians. If you notice that next verse, look down in verse 35. The town clerk quiets the mob. In verse 36, trying to gain control, the clerk tells them to be quiet and do nothing rashly. And then finally in that 41st verse, they were told to go home. Then as Luke records, Acts chapter 20 and verse 1, the uproar had ceased. So, you look at these instances in the book of Acts, 4 of them now that we've taken a look at, and you can see the kind of disastrous results that yelling and screaming, that working ourselves up into these fits of anger and rage have. And just because we're looking at ancient places, ancient events, with ancient people, don't ever think that you're immune to it. Because when we start thinking about the problem being with us today, there's a lot of issues. Sometimes there's in the church, and I've mentioned this before, business meetings, elder and congregational meetings. You hear it in the foyer, sometimes you hear it in the parking lot. The rage, the outbursts of anger, the wrath, the malice, a brother against brother, sister against sister. It's just incredible. Or you think about certainly in marriages, husbands and wives, yelling at one another, screaming, shouting, then walking away. Why walk away? Why walk away? You know, if you want to try to work something out, why walk away? You see it in families. You see it with parents shouting, not warnings. I mean, we understand as parents sometimes you've got to get pretty hard with kids. But shouting, not warnings, out of anger, kids yelling, going to the room, slamming the door, rolling the eyes. That anger, that outburst of wrath, the yelling and the screaming, finally, in society, where whatever it is, school board meetings, band, athletic booster, Walmart, social media, all caps, we just see it everywhere. We see it all over the place. And it's so pervasive. Jenny and I, going up and down the street just yesterday, heard a parent, Jenny heard more distinctly what was said, and that wasn't good. I heard it. I heard the commotion. She actually heard it and understood what was being said with a parent to her children. I mean, essentially cursing her children out. I mean, it was, and it's just stuff like that that you see all of the time. And whether we see it, you know, in churches or in marriages or in families or in society, it just happens all of the time. It happened back then and it happens now. So that now brings up the question. And what we spend just the next few minutes trying to talk about before we close is, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And I want to suggest to you, let's look in Colossians chapter 3, because I think there is a very, very good idea in Colossians chapter 3 that all I want to do is just develop it a little bit as we go through the rest of this lesson. This lesson is a simple one. Colossians chapter 3, and let's look in verse 16. Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. That seems to be a bit out of place, unusual to bring up in the context of what we're talking about tonight. But I want you to think, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. When Paul wrote Colossians 3, verse 16, the word of Christ dwelling in them richly is dwelling in the sense of their singing. And we enjoy that. We like that. But there's another very, very important way where the word of Christ dwells within us, hopefully all of the time. And as it dwells in us all of the time, it can give us some much needed power. Now, what are those words? Well, I've picked out a few of them, and a few of them addresses the point of how we express ourselves, whether we're going to express ourselves in a calm and gentle way, or whether we're going to do it in the way that we've already seen in the book of Acts. So let's kind of step through these. Turn, please, if you would, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 9, or if you would like, read it off of the screen, because Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 9 says, do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Anger rests in the bosom of fools. Now, it's very, very clear, and we can make the point that if someone is going to be angry, again, in the outburst of the yelling and the screaming, that someone most definitely doesn't have self-control. And this is essentially where I want to end the lesson, is the concept of self-control. But Solomon says something even more notable. It's not just someone who lacks self-control. It's someone who's a fool. You know, one of the most, of course, there's more disrespectful words to call someone than a fool in our current society. But a fool is pretty insulting. So Solomon says, you know, look, anger rests in the bosoms of fools, and it's going to come out. And it's either going to come out via word or it's going to come out via action. And I would make the case that it's a whole lot easier for it to come out via word. And so this is something that every child of God has to watch against. When we turn, for example, in Proverbs chapter 25, let's look Proverbs chapter 25, verse 15. For by long forbearance a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks a bone. Two ideas that are put together here, parallelism, I like this one. By long forbearance, a ruler is persuaded. By someone gently taking their time, a ruler can be brought about to consider something that they wouldn't consider. And then the power of a gentle tongue, what does it do? It breaks a bone. Figuratively, of course, speaking. But a gentle tongue breaks a bone. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 17. Look, Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 17, because it said, words of the wise, spoken quietly, should be heard rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. What kind of language should you have? Words of the wise. And how should they be spoken? Spoken quietly. And I'll tell you, when you think about this one, and you also couple it together with what we had seen in Ecclesiastes 7, verse 9, for anger rests in the bosoms of fools. All of you guys understand and know, when you really get worked up, and I mean when you really start letting the words fly in anger, not only do you not manifest yourself in a wise way, but what you say is far from being calm and reasonable and certainly not scriptural. So think about that. Look at what that says. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Have the control. Let's look and let's consider Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, one of my favorite ones, just simply because it's so short and to the point. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Again, the reaction of yelling and screaming usually is going to present yelling and screaming. I've heard it expressed this way. People generally, and I think this is a good rule to consider, people generally match energy. People generally match energy. For a lot of people who have the unfortunate ability to have to deal with the public a lot, people in retail, all of our teachers in the room, people with customer service, a lot of times people match energy, particularly with customers. So it's actually interesting if you look at how customer service people are trained. It's fascinating. But they learn to de-escalate people. When in reality, a lot of times if people come at us with the yelling and the screaming, then we're ones to actually come out and match it. Look at Proverbs 15, verse 1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up that anger. The matching of energy will get you nowhere. Now let's think about some New Testament ones, because we certainly don't want to leave it out. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8. Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. But now you yourselves are to put off all of these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, and filthy language that's out of your mouth. And yes, I do mean the anger and the wrath and the malice that comes out in our language. But I do want to suggest to you that the end of that verse, the filthy language that comes out of your mouth, usually we think about, of course, the natural understanding of filthy language. That is included in what is said here. But the connection of the filthy language also with the anger and the wrath and the malice and the blasphemy is the product of a heart that's given to, in that moment, the anger, the hatred, the malice, and the wrath. Meaning that the language that comes out, yes, may very well be words that we understand to be so-called dirty, but the filthy language can also be that language which is just simply absolutely unbecoming, both in what is said and in the nature in the way that it's said by God's children. So think about that in Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. We certainly don't want to use filthy language, but we don't want to use regular language just used in a very corrupt or unbecoming or ungodly in a filthy way. James chapter 1. James chapter 1, very, very good. James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. The wrath of man doesn't produce the righteousness of God. This says exactly the point that I was trying to make just a moment ago. People get worked up in what they say and what takes place. What comes out of their mouth is not representative, both in the nature of the way it comes out and in the words that are said. It doesn't produce the righteousness of God. James chapter 3 and verse 6. James chapter 3 and verse 6 says this, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body, and it sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire by hell. Words destroy. Words destroy. And then finally, let's end with actually going backwards to Proverbs chapter 21, verse 23. Whoever guards his mouth and tongue keeps his soul from troubles. Guards his mouth, keeps his soul from troubles. That's a good thought. Now, how is it that we do that? Well, let's turn, if you would, 1 John chapter 4. Let's look in 1 John chapter 4. Just make a couple of little ideas here, a couple of little points. 1 John chapter 4. And we're going to look in the 4th verse. 1 John chapter 4. We'll get to verse 4. Let's actually start by reading verse 1, and we'll get some context here. 1 John 4, verse 1. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. Every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and is now already in the world. You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. Now, these people have been assured of their victory over people who are denying the deity of Jesus Christ. And what is said in verse 4? They're able to overcome because of a very, very important note, a very important rule, an important fact that every child of God remembers. The power that we have, the power of the gospel, is greater than the power of the devil. Remember, yelling and screaming is a tool of the devil. So what can counteract it? What can actually overcome it? Well, it's the power of God. Where is that power of God? It's found in the power of Scripture. That is why we started this point by noting we need to let the Word of Christ dwell in us richly. So that Word of Christ, for example, in Galatians chapter 5 has this to say. In Galatians chapter 5, and if you'll notice in Galatians chapter 5, and we start in verse 19 with the works of the flesh, you're going to note that some of these works of the flesh are very, very anger-based, just like our yelling and screaming. Galatians chapter 5, verse 19, now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness. So these idea of sexual sins, but we keep on moving on. Idolatry and sorcery, the ones that relate to false religion, again, seems all perfectly well placed, well put. But then look where he goes. Hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envies, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like. The drunkenness and the revelries, again, kind of its own separate component, but all of those in the middle are all elements of division. Of division. Where's that produced? With anger and with hatred. How is that manifested? In the yelling and in the screaming. So, these have the consequence, of which I tell you beforehand, as I told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, on the other hand, the fruit of the Spirit is love, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. So, self-control. And the 24th verse continues on. Those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and its desires. Those temptations to do exactly what are in verses 15 through 21. So those people who have that self-control, along with the other fruit of the Spirit, are those people who are able to overcome. But self-control. I find it very interesting that when you look in 2 Peter chapter 1, when we look in 2 Peter chapter 1, we took a reading from that this morning, but in 2 Peter chapter 1, and we start in verse 5, when Peter is opening his second letter, and he's talking about how you need to grow. In the second chapter, he's going to talk about how, first chapter, here's how we need to grow. The second chapter is how that growth sometimes is set aside, which is by false teaching. But look at these elements that it takes for growth. 2 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 5. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to your virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance. Self-control. How do I find that? How do I learn that? How do I get that? Brethren, it's by letting the Word of Christ dwell in us richly. Make no mistake. I can look back through the elements in the book of Acts. I could go back. We can go all the way back to the beginning. We go all the way back to Genesis. And we can see yelling and screaming. We can see people in turmoil. We can see people in anger. We can see people whipped up into mob action. And we can see it accomplishing wrong. But then, every day of our existence in our American society, and I would imagine it is in societies all over the world, we can see the exact same kind of results by people not having control over their anger. And so I want to end with this very interesting quote by Frederick Buechner, who wrote, "Of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun." Anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontations still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it's a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are working down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. The skeleton at the feast is you. I like 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and with this we'll close. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, when we look in verse 33, again, a great principle set in the context of the Corinthians arguing and fussing and fighting and being disturbed by spiritual gifts, something presumably there to help them grow, to help them to develop into what they ought to be. Misusing it. Paul has to write, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33, God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all of the churches of the saints. There's a big, big difference between anger and the ensuing bitterness and confusion that it produces, and the peace of the gospel, the peace of allowing the Word of Christ dwelling in people richly and changing their lives. There's a big, big difference between the two of them. There's a big difference in people who are given over to the production of the fruit of the Spirit in their lives and the people who have the works of the flesh always there. Again, it's a simple lesson, a simple consideration, but it's one that's worthy. Because society, and I mean again especially ours, and maybe my whole assertion about American society is off base. It may very well be. It feels like we're going through more troubled times. It feels like that frustration, it feels like that pressure that we're put under makes everyone a little bit more prone to this. But maybe it's no different than it's always been. And if it's not, then the warning is still appropriate and it's still applicable. We need to have control over ourselves. And we not only need to have control over ourselves as far as the I think the most common application would be, as we read in Galatians chapter 5, those things of a sexual nature, but also of our mind ourselves. How do we remain in the joy and the peace? How do we remain in the light and the life that Christ came to give us? Well, it's by getting control over that anger and that wrath and that malice, and how that overcomes it, how that comes out in our speech. We need to understand that these things are not good. These things tear people down. These things create division. They create confusion. And they are effective. Have control. Know that what you do is watched by a lot of people. If you're an adult, what you're doing is being watched by your children. It's being watched by your grandchildren. It's being watched by your brethren. It's being watched by coworkers. It's being watched by neighbors. We heard it yesterday. People see, people realize, people know. And I've known a lot of times the most gentle and soft-spoken people sometimes on a pew on a Sunday, the very next day can turn into people just like we've described tonight. And it doesn't need to be. We need to be people of control. We need to be people of holiness. We need to be people of righteousness. Now, to that end, we have had a song that is selected as our invitation song. We do this because we know that there are people sometimes who struggle mightily with overcoming these kinds of wickedness. And we want you to know, as we sing these songs, and every time we do it, we understand that's the case. We know people struggle. We know people have difficulties. We give people a time of inviting to talk to us about it. And the purpose of talking to us about it is for you, in confessing your sins, to come to the point of repentance where you're ready to say not only that you're willing to change, but that you ask God for that forgiveness, and you know that you have a lot of brethren here who stand in support of you. So that's our time that we've reached. And that's our invitation that we want to extend to you. And that's what we hope and pray, that you respond. Let's do so. Come up, talk to us while we stand and Jeremy leads us.